So I'm really excited about this discussion, and I'm really happy to see that reception. My name is Hayden King. I'm Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on Chimnasing, which is Ojibwe Potawatomi community. Toronto is about 2 hours south of us, and I'm also the executive director of Yellowhead Institute, which is an Indigenous research and education center concerned with the reclamation of Indigenous land and life. And some of the work that we do is our annual red paper projects, which focus on Indigenous self-determination and the restitution of land, economy, power. And we're starting to think about what that means in a northern context, especially with modern treaties. And that's sort of provoked the conversation that we're having here today with experts in the field of this discussion. So Yellowhead Institute has organized this event, and we've also got some support from the Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project, which is a 5-year SSHRC partnership grant to study modern treaty implementation. So we want to thank those folks and thank Carleton University for helping us put this discussion together. 2 years into a pandemic, you all know the Zoom webinar discussion panel and how these work. There isn't much to say beyond that. We take the security of these particular meetings very seriously, and so some participant functionality has been disabled just to prevent any sort of surprises, but you know, I don't expect it. But if for any reason we have to shut down our Zoom discussion, we will regroup and relaunch the Zoom exactly 5 minutes later. So for any reason, if we shut down the Zoom, we'll be back up and running in exactly 5 minutes. And I think that's all that I really have to say. I do want to introduce our moderator for the discussion, a colleague of mine over the past few months that I've been really fortunate to work with and learn from. Jay Lightfoot is the community relations lead at Yellowhead Institute for some research that we're doing on modern treaty implementation and land back in a modern treaty context. And Jay is working on what that means in a Nunavut setting and also in the Nunatsiavut setting. And Janine's from Makkovik in Nunatsiavut and works a little bit for the Nunatsiavut government as well. And prior to these roles that Janine has taken on the last little while, she worked at Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated in the Department of Social and Cultural Development. So really happy to have Jay moderating this event, and I will pass things over to her.
Thanks, Hayden. I'm super nervous. I'm not accustomed to doing Zoom moderation, so I'm really nervous / excited to be doing this with everyone tonight. So thanks everybody. Thanks to the panelists for making time for this conversation. As everyone knows, we have 4 panelists joining us today. We have in the West, Kris Statnyk and Chief Dina Tizya Tramm, and on the more easterly side, closer to me, we have Kunuk Inuutiq joining us from Iqaluit and Natan Obed joining us from Ottawa. And thanks to everybody else for joining us who's tuning into the conversation tonight. So we have about 2 hours together, and we'll also have a poetic address from Laakkuluk, Williamson, Bathory. So outside of that, we'll allow the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll get right into kind of the question and answer around modern treaties, land back, and Indigenous self-determination. that should bring us up to about, what time is it? Well, 7:40 my time, 6:40 in the Eastern time zone. Or sorry, 7:40 in the Eastern time zone, 8:40 my time. We're getting close to my bedtime now. And then we'll have a question and answer from guests who are joining us. I think that's it for the agenda. And I'll get right into it. And I'm so excited, kicking off, I guess, our evening. I'm really happy to introduce Laakkuluk Williamson Bathory, who is Kalaalleq, or Greenlandic Inuk performance artist, poet, actor, storyteller, and writer based in Inuutiq. Most recently, she was the recipient of the 2021 Sobeys Art Award for championing the visual arts and cultural expression. Laakkuluk is known for performing Williamson, a Greenlandic mass dance that involves storytelling centered around 3 elements: fear, humor, and sexuality. She describes Williamson as both a political and cultural act and an idiosyncratic art form. Inspired by her children, family, and the land, Laakkuluk uses her art to push back against the colonial narrative of art, expression, love, gender, and life in Indigenous communities. So thank you for joining us, Laakkuluk. I know you're really busy, and I feel so privileged that you're joining us here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been asked to open this event with a poetic address, and because it was Jay, I wrote a new poem for her. It's called Below the Billow. The ocean breathes in and out and tips back and forth in long diurnal beats. Tininuk, ulinuk, tininuk, ulinuk. The sun and the moon are in constant, perpetual distance from one another. Our footing on Earth is just a tiny grip on all of those wobbly orbits filled with lust, disgust, and everything in between. This is the story of the sun and the moon. Statnyk aningallu, the pull between the sister and the brother. On the open water, a seal disappears into a trough and then reappears at the top of a wave. Our boat pops up high and a moment later bobs low. I hold a rifle and try to aim, but our 2 sets of beings are out of sync, and a bullet will never pierce that seal. Mallin, anginilmik, puishishimangilanga. In the shallows, we chase a pod of beluga whales. We can smell them and hear their blowholes erupt with quickened exhalations. They suck in a bit of breath and dive back in. The sun is hot, and the mirage around us makes us feel that we are at the base of a bowl of water, and the whales are swimming above us, all of us salivating for the kill. Matak nikillu mamamnomik. At low tide, we walk down to what will be the bottom of the ocean in 6 hours' time. We listen to the slick sound of millions of tiny exoskeletoned invertebrates. They move their multitude of legs in a slurry of seawater and clay. Amumayuit, uiluit, Kisavasad, siulakut, kanayuit, agkawyay, ugtsunayd, kangayuin, kinguit, mahani sisoaktun. Our shadows and vibrations cause throngs of eyeballs and antennae to quiver, shells shut, fleshy appendages to retract. In the winter, the pressure ice rumbles and mutters as it constantly repositions. When the new moon is at its sharpest sliver, seawater gushes ashore, the same way a bowhead whale hisses out to let water between its baleen and to catch krill. The salty, cold blue water oozes over the white glaze. Pink jellyfish slip by, freezing and disintegrating as the tide changes direction. Nuachluit, nunamuchikirachtut, sorluullurissad anaktut. In the summer, I plunge naked into the water just to know the shock the fish feel when we pull them out of the nets. My lungs, my flesh fight to resurface, my bones ache, my instinct to survive rejects the cold. I explode back onto land, gasping, tingling, and extraordinarily euphoric. I imagine the exact opposite is true for fish. Their gills flailing, muscles spasming, their iridescent skin frying in the dry, hot air. Such a gift, we get to eat them. One being dies, and the other is nourished. Umasokatas tokusok. Umasok apa nerisinavok. One world touches another. Atula, alula, atula, alula. The land caresses the ocean. The ocean licks the land, and they rock together. Enthralled by the spectacle of the sun and the moon, here we all lie, animals and humans alike, caught beneath the billow of it all. Thank you.
I always felt bad for the person who had to speak after Laakkuluk, having to come up with words after being visually brought to a different space is always tough. So thank you, Laakkuluk. You always thank you for grounding, helping us ground this conversation in imagery of the land and the unique connection we have to the land as Indigenous people. You always do this so powerfully and beautifully, so thank you very much. So that's the person who speaks after Laakkuluk. We'll continue on with the agenda. So we have prepared some questions, and I'll start with the first question. Because this conversation is kind of grounded in what does land back look like in the North in a modern treaty context. I'll ask the first question to you, Natan. But before I move on, I know that there was some questions about letting people in, like the max admission, I guess, for the conversation. So before I get started, I just wanted to ask to see if there's something that we can do to help to admit more people.
Yeah, it looks like there is we for whatever reason our limit is only 100, and we thought it was 500. So we're just trying to figure out what the issue is, why we can't increase it to 500. So we'll keep working on that. And in the meantime, for those that can't get in, we'll have the recording.
Okay, great. I'm like excited and nervous that everybody wants to be joining this meeting. Anyway, moving on. We'll jump right into it with the first question. Actually, first I'll dial it back. We'll start with introductions, and we'll start in the West, actually. So, Kris, did you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your relationship to the land and how this relates to modern treaties.
Yes, Dringwinzi, Masicho, Jay, for your moderating, and I'd also like to thank Hayden and also the other panelists for joining the discussion. It's something I'm looking forward to participating in. I am a citizen of the Bunta-Gwitchin First Nation, which is in North Yukon. My mother is Marie Bruce, and my grandparents are the late Dr. Reverend Ellen Bruce and Robert Bruce Sr. In terms of the work I do and the things I'm involved in, I'm a lawyer. I practice in the area of Aboriginal law, and I work with both modern treaty and non-treaty communities in both the Yukon and British Columbia. Including work with my own community, the Bunta-Gwitchin First Nation. And most of this work is primarily revolved around, issues related to self-determination and advancing self-determination, and, ranges from, participation in negotiation, implementation, and sometimes litigation. So a broad sort of range of issues, and I do have sort of a bit of focus on land and resource management and governance issues in my work. I'm also on the board of advisors for Yellowhead Institute, and so really supportive of this work of thinking about these questions like land back in the modern treaty context and in the northern context. In terms of my relationship to land, I think I would say my relationship to land is primarily based upon or defined by my family, community, history, and I guess probably unsurprisingly, I'll also say law in terms of defining my roles and responsibilities and relationships to land. Obviously, it's through my mom's side and my ancestors, in which I'm connected to the community of Old Crow in the Bunta-Gwitchin traditional territory in North Yukon. And we have a modern treaty which we've been implementing for over 2 decades now. And so I see my relationship to the land and to my home territory at least being somewhat defined as well, or shaped by this monumental agreement that was entered into when I was just 6 years old, and now my generation is having to pick up and carry forward that vision. And so I see that as really influencing sort of my relationship to the land and wanting to make sure that as my generation, I'm doing what that past generation did in terms of thinking about our children and their future, and how are we going to make sure that it's a good future for them. And I also, I'm also informed by my relationship to land through my wife and her family, which is where I live in her nation's homelands in New Hazelton, British Columbia. My wife and my son are Gitxsan, and matrilineally they belong to the Laaksuluk or Eagle Clan, House of Sakamhikok. And within their nation, their relationship to land is really governed by their hereditary house system, the feast hall, and Gitxsan laws. And so, me being married into this nation, that comes with certain responsibilities that I have to maintain here in my wife's homelands. So yeah, I see that as really also informing my perspective of, a nation that has also historically, doesn't have a modern treaty and has sought other ways to, secure the future for their children. And so I guess it helps give me a different perspective outside of my own community. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion, and thank you.
Thank you, Kris. We'll move further east. Chief Tizya Tramm, did you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your relationship to the land and how that relates to modern treaties.
Masi chot Jun Gwinzi Shalagnai, Bathory Dana Tizya Tramm Ojri Chiktali Bantakwichin. Good day, all of my relations. My name is Dana Tizya Tramm, and I am the chief of the Bantakwichin First Nation. I have worked a lot, many different jobs going through the South. Am a survivor of addictions and suicides and attempts, and had quite a bit of a sordid past, and found my way, worked my way up through creating youth empowerment and cultural revitalization organizations single-handedly, creating programming into our traditional territories, and framing youth's experience around the Peel watershed and the proposed unilateral development at that time. So really youth-based empowerment organizations, and which quickly led to my adoption onto the leadership for the Bantakwichin First Nation. My grandparents are old Peter Tizya and Clara Linklater of our territories. On the other side of my family, well, first of all, on the Gwich'in side, there is an archaeological dig that has proof of human evidence, carbon dating to about 24,000 years ago, about 36 kilometers downriver from our community, over double the established site in the Yucatan Peninsula of 12,500 years. So our family goes back very far, and I can trace my lines going to Northeast Alaska and through our oral traditions to when we first came to these lands millennia ago. On the other side of my family, I am the grandson of Carl and Edita Tramm, survivors of World War II in Lübeck, Germany. Our family is ancient, going back to the Indo-European inklings of language. We can establish our family lines back to the Raven clans before the time of Gaul. So a very ancient background from two sides of the world. So I take an epistemological approach to things, which is epistemology being, what do we know to be true and how do we know it to be true? So walking in both worlds of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, as well as Western best practices. So my relationship to the land is really indicative of every way, shape, and form that can be quantified, measured, as this next generation inheriting a modern treaty, and as well as our lands. well, you can actually, with the right pair of eyes, see the last waves of modernity and colonialism that broke among the rocks of my community, Old Crow, Yukon Territory, 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where on the forethought of our elders refused a permanent all-season road to our community as a form of protection, insulating us from the rest of the world. But as we know, the greatest homogenizer, the television, bulldozed its way into our community. And we've been dealing with this incredible onset. And just as an example for your viewers, my grandfather was born out on the land to candlelight, and now his grandson flies around the world with a supercomputer in his back pocket. So that journey has been exponential and very violent, just between mere generations. So for me as a young man who is a statistical anomaly among my peers, as many of them are not here today, for me to get back out onto my land, surviving drug and alcohol addiction, surviving suicide attempts, surviving everything, I am now basically reborn, implementing an age-old agreement, one in which I've lived that same history in an accelerated manner as I would make treaties with gangsters and addicts on the streets, many of which are broken, to now adopting a modern treaty with the federal government, with all due respect, very likened to a lot of the gangsters I rubbed shoulders with on the streets. So the lands and my relationship with them, as I think the best way to put it, Yuval Noah Harari writes that you can dissect a human cell and you will not find a declaration for human rights. And what I take from those writings is that there is the law of man, the written law of man, but also the law of nature which governs the cell. And through empirical sciences, I have found my way through the great ebb and flows of history and cycles and patterns in biology to arrive into a traditional framework that frames my modern experiences, but anchors them into an ancient book of my people, which dislocates myself, and I'm dissolved into a much larger being. So of all of that to say, I do appreciate this opportunity, the Yellowhead Institute, the fellow panelists, but make no mistake that it's not so much myself speaking to you today, as this is not my voice, but the voice of my ancestors on both sides of the world who survived many wars, famines, and overcame all adversities to deliver this voice so that I may carry it for the grandchildren. So these are just my experiences, a kaleidoscope and mosaic of readings, writings, and experiences that I now have this sacred opportunity today to share with everyone. So for that opportunity, I give you thanks, Masi.
Thank you, Dana. Moving on, we'll go to Kunuk. Sandra Inuutiq, I see on your screen. Can you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your relationship to the land and maybe how it relates to modern treaties.
Maybe a mini lesson in terms of how to pronounce my name. Many of you might have heard of Jerry Natan, who is my homie. He calls me Cool Nook. Just drop the L. Kunuk is my name. I'm named after my great grandmother. My family is from central North Baffin Island. When I was thinking about how I was going to introduce myself, which I don't like to do, I was thinking mostly about my homeland, which is very mountainous. If you YouTube Baffin Island base jumping, you'll see the landscape where I grew up, where I spent my childhood with my grandparents. I was very lucky that I lived in a family that were last to live in a sod house. Our family was the last family known in our region to live in a sod house, and that's how I spent my childhood, mostly living on hunted, harvested food. And then once I lost my grandparents, I moved in with my mother and my stepfather. I moved to Iqaluit to live with them, which was a crash course in terms of Qadlunat lifestyle and a very mixed community. So I think a lot of us are have different ways of self-reclamation. My hometown, they call me Kunuk, and Sandra is only a name that I began to know when I moved to Iqaluit as a preteen. And so it feels personal when somebody calls me Kunuk, that they know me. And it's also a name that has been passed down through generations. And for us, when we're named after people, it's believed that the personality traits are passed down. And my last name, Inuutiq, was my great-grandfather's name. And when the surname project came around for Inuit, after the E numbers were given, the families were mostly the male head of the family were asked whether they wanted to adopt a Christian name and have their name as the last name, or adopt their father's name as the last name. So my grandfather chose, rather than adopting a Christian name, chose his father's name as Inuutiq. So my two names, Kunuk Inuutiq, are quite significant to me for those reasons. Through my childhood, I saw how often my grandparents went against the grain of expectation to modernize and live in the community. We lived in an outpost camp, and people in the community saw us as backward and old-fashioned. And so every time we came into town, my grandmother was very careful in terms of how she dressed me. She wanted me to dress with new clothes because she knew that we were seen as a kind of backward or old-fashioned family, but they did that for us so that we would have a secure foundation in our upbringing. So that's who I am, and that's my attachment to my Nuna and my family. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kunuk. Natan, did you want to introduce yourself, a bit about your relationship to the land and how that relates to modern treaties?
Nakomik Jay, and it's good to hear all of those stories. I can't help but think about what Laakkuluk was sharing and think that so much of what you were talking about was actually the ocean. So for Inuit, it's just as much ocean back, I guess, as land back. But it also made me want to have some Iqaluit, pitsi or huac or whatever. So I was just thinking of the inventory in my fridge and freezer, and I think I can have some afterwards. But I digress. We're here to talk about modern treaties, and I'm originally from Nain Nunatsiavut. I grew up all over the place, but people always ask me where I'm from. I always say Nain because that's where I belong. That's where I feel the most belonging in the world. And I also know the land and the waters around Nain in a much different way than I think I know any other environment that I've ever lived in. I've been in Ottawa now for 6.5 years, and I know the Rideau Canal, I know the Gatineau Park, I know downtown, but I don't have a spiritual connection and a feeling of forever belonging I suppose, to this part of the world, and I do when I'm at home. My father, at one point in his career, was the director of land claims for the Labrador Inuit Association during the time of the land use and occupancy projects. And so I have a show and tell. I have here is an original copy, or one of the original copies, of the Labrador Inuit Association's Our Footprints Are Everywhere, which is the Inuit land use and occupancy study for the foundation of our land claim agreement. And it was given to me by my father, and not many 7 or 8 year olds get land use and occupancy studies as gifts from their parents. So there's just, it's been a part of my life, and not always a good one. I mean, this isn't, these stories of our lives are not just as simple as like you're born into land claim royalty and you grow up and then you do the things that you were meant to do. I found my calling in university doing my thesis on the potential impacts of a land claim agreement on Labrador Inuit. And I did a lot of research on modern treaties and Inuit land claim agreements. And it really got me excited about using the skills that I had learned in university to help with the land claim movement and to help in any way I could for Canadian Inuit. And so ever since then, I've worked for land claim organizations. I've dedicated my career to this, and I believe in it. It's just something, and I also believe in Inuit governance and our ability to self-determine our future. And it can always be better. And we always have to find these ways. So being in this academic setting here today, I love chatting about this, like imagining a different future and bringing in voices that give perspective and diversity to the conversation. I just stop with another story of belonging, and that was a few years ago, and I was in the Torngat Mountains, which is a national park now, but it was where my grandparents are from on my father's side. And I was with my relative, John Gerarsi, and he was showing me where my grandparents had their nets in the summer, where they had their tents. And I didn't know any of this. It was only the second or third time I'd ever been to that particular part of the world. And it just shows the dislocation that we've had from our immediate ancestors in some cases about the places that were just home to Inuit. So land back for me is also just learning about who I actually am. And it takes a lifetime in a time of colonization to really understand where you come from sometimes. So when I hear Kunuk talk about being raised by her grandparents and having those foundational experiences of belonging in the way that Inuit lived before coercion into communities, that's really special. And it's a perspective I think that we all need to cherish as well. The people who understand the world in a different way because of the connection to land, because of just the power of living in that way.
Thanks, Natan. So I just want to note that the maximum amount of participants that we'll have tonight is 100. So it's a small group. So we'll get started. I jumped the gun earlier. I was too excited. I'm going to start with the first question. I'm going to ask you, Natan. Given that this conversation is about modern treaties and land back in a northern context, in a modern treaty context. Is it a question anymore that we have an implementation issue when it comes to modern treaties? If so, what are the barriers and where are the issues?
Thanks, Jay. In my role as Inuit president, the primary concern of our board of directors is the implementation of land claim agreements, because they're the foundational relationship between Inuit governance and the Crown. And if the implementation of these agreements isn't taken seriously or underfunded, or in some cases completely disregarded in decision-making, it creates conflict. And also we spend our time chasing the conflict or chasing the resolution of the conflict instead of trying to build something together. Land claim agreements are, as Dwayne Smith, Inuvialuit Regional Corporation Chair, always says, are just as much the federal government's as they are Inuit agreements. There are two parties, and each party decided to enter into these agreements, and each party has obligations within them. And often, once the agreements are signed, the federal government ceases to see themselves as a partner in an agreement with just as much responsibility for implementation as the Inuit party. And often the federal government has then seen its role in trying to figure out how to do the least amount it possibly can without breaking any laws, to ensure that it is not exposed to financial considerations or time considerations or other challenges that it sees as challenges to protect the public good. Only in the last few years, we've seen a change in the way ministers and the Prime Minister consider their relationship with Inuit and consider modern treaties. I still don't think that the vast majority of the Canadian bureaucracy, the Canadian government bureaucracy, imagines modern treaties as a challenge of the best possible, how do we best possibly describe the respect and the self-deterrent of Indigenous peoples and the partnership between Indigenous peoples in Canada. I always have thought of Crown Indigenous Relations, and formerly INAC, principally considering the risk associated with anything that they do with Inuit when it comes to land claims implementation. The precedent that might be set by giving hundreds of $millions for language training, for Inuktitut training, to build a bilingual government in Nunavut, or to ensure that co-management structures, when they make decisions, that ministers don't interfere with those decisions, that ministers respect the nature of what the agreements were about. Too often, people who are making decisions about co-management decisions, about land claim implementation challenges, haven't read the agreement, haven't considered their primary role within this process. I've been in meetings with ministers where they get annoyed with me when I'm going through the minutia of a particular scenario that is related to their department and related to land claim implementation. And at some point, one of the ministers has said, like, this is just too confusing. This is like, we can't work on this. You're going to have to simplify this. And my response in the moment was, this is your agreement. These are your conditions that you've put on. I've just been using the legislation that the federal government has created to tell you about where there's an opportunity and what your responsibility is. So in many cases, we as leaders, when we brief the federal government about our implementation challenges, they can't be bothered with even understanding it and think that it's our problem and not theirs. And this really has to change. And I think there's some ministers and some departments and some individual bureaucrats that have been amazing, that have seen this for what it is and want to do their best within the land claim implementation conversations and exercises that we've been doing. But it still is now, it's a belief issue. Does the federal government believe in land claims? And if so, are they willing to completely change the way in which they perceive them so they're not risk-centered and they're more opportunity-centered for what is possible under these agreements, what's possible under the adjacent and corresponding federal legislation? Where are the opportunities to fully breathe life into these agreements? And unfortunately, we see ourselves on the other side, in courts, fighting decisions or fighting the lack of action or fighting chronic underfunding. And it just shows you, I think, where we are. But I still preach this gospel in Ottawa that we have to take an opportunity approach to these agreements because they fall under constitutional protection. They are part of our box of rights. And I still believe that Canada and the federal government will find itself in a place where it celebrates these agreements and wants to do whatever it can to help their full implementation, especially in a time now we're concerned about sovereignty. And we are also in a time of, I think there's an international focus on our human rights abuses and also a focus in this country on reconciliation. I appreciate the ability to talk about this, but there are just as many opportunities for success as there are barriers in this implementation issue, even if we are challenged and upset about our lack of progress on a number of different fronts, in any part of our days.
Excellent. I'm trying to keep time. I budgeted 15 minutes for you. You did it in 8-ish, but I know you can have that conversation all day long. So thanks, Natan. I'm going to move on to the next question. This one will be for Kris. These implementation challenges affect land issues too. What is required for a treaty future that supports Indigenous access and authority regarding lands and resources?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In terms of what's needed for a treaty future that supports Indigenous access and authority to land and resources, when I think of this question, it reminds me of what I understand of the negotiation process and the political process that my elders and past leaders and family members, deliberated and discussed, at a community level, but also, with our neighbors and just in terms of what are we trying to achieve in this moment. and why are we seeking a treaty in the first place, a modern treaty. And, you know, it was very clear, you know, I think there's this, you know, really simplistic misunderstanding of modern treaties and land around, you know, certainty provisions or, you know, certain legal designations that lands might get under a land claim agreement. But, you know, when I go back to what the vision was of those past leaders, you know, it was really about, you know, not so much defining who owns the land, although that certainly, you know, defining ownership was an objective and interest of the Crown government in the process. It was more about putting in place in creating a new tool or instrument that would make sure that we could still live up to our responsibilities, you know, to our whole territory. And I would say even beyond that, you know, as Gwich'in, you know, we have relatives and communities on, you know, the NWT side of the mountains, as well as in Alaska. And so we have these, I would say, sort of political realities that have impacted our nation, whether it's, you know, how land has been designated or lines have been drawn on maps. And certainly those things do have a real life impact on us. But in terms of how we see ourselves in our relationship to the land and our responsibilities, none of that's really changed. And, you know, it was through the treaty that our past leaders saw as, you know, if we don't own all of the land, we need to have control of it. You know, we need to have meaningful participation and involvement in the management of those lands, including through the creation of, you know, new institutions and processes. And importantly, you know, speaking to the Yukon agreements, you know, a fundamental objective of sustainable development. You know, when we're implementing these new institutions and processes, you know, this is what we're moving towards, is a vision where we're not going to undermine our culture, our land, our way of life, but, you know, we're going to have greater control over our, you know, political, economic, social life. You know, I see, you know, that vision still being the same, but needing to make sure that those processes are being implemented with that fundamental objective and that vision that our elders had in mind. You know, we're seeing, for example, in the Yukon, you know, with the slow pace of implementation around regional land use planning, for example, you know, we're seeing, you know, just this past week, you know, our neighbors to the south, First Nation of Nacho-Nyak-Dun, in court, you know, arguing that, you know, there's this treaty promise to have a regional land use plan in place, which hasn't happened yet. Meanwhile, there's still, you know, mineral exploration activity, you know, being authorized in these lands that, you know, we really want to plan about, you know, what's the overall region going to look like before we start, you know, continuing to authorize more activities. And so, you know, I see these you know, these as examples of where we really need to continue to uphold that original vision in this process. And I think we also need to look to other tools, and Natan referenced, you know, human rights standards and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think that's also one way we can begin to look at our treaty frameworks and the manner in which they're being implemented. One are the obligations in the agreements themselves, you know, these constitutionally binding obligations, are they actually being implemented and fulfilled? And if not, what do we do about that? But also, are they actually meeting just basic human rights standards that also exist as other standards that the government has to uphold? And I think that introduces lots of interesting discussions about, you know, free, prior, informed consent, you know, not as, sort of this transactional principle, but, as something that's embedded in the treaty relationship as, an ongoing process, and making sure that we have a meaningful say in decisions that are being made on the land or about the land through these institutions and processes, but also seeking other ways to hold government accountable, if and as we need to. So I see that, the treaty future, in short, is really being about, making sure that we're continuing to pass down that knowledge to younger people in our communities about that historic process of negotiation, what was talked about and deliberated, and sort of what we're striving towards, and keep that at the forefront.
Excellent. Thanks, Kris. I'm going to move on to the next question for you, Kunuk. We hear a lot about land back in the South, especially around land reclamation. What does land back mean to you in the North in a modern treaty context?
Okay. First, special shout out to Ayu Morgan, who I know is listening. Hi, Ayu. Land back. It's interesting how even the name of Nunavut means our homeland or our land. And so when the land claim agreement was signed, Inuit obviously it was such a strong statement of reclamation of land, of our just taking control over self-determination. And it was really interesting in terms of for Nunavut, we have the land claim agreement, but as part of the land claim agreement, we also created a public government. So it was a two-package deal. And so it's really hard to separate the two parts because as a result of the land claim, we created a territory, and there was so much hope when the land claim was signed and the expectation of a government. There was Canadian narrative around how this is the largest land grab in the country, and what a great achievement it is, for Canada in terms of their relationship with Indigenous people, to create a new government. We're creating a new territory. And so we are now 29 years into the land claim agreement and 22 years into a public government. And when I listen to Natan and Kris, honestly, I feel so cynical in terms of where we are, because what I see is a lot of social despair and Inuit lives not having improved. Our social conditions, we face desperate housing conditions. We face the highest food insecurity, where 7 out of 10 families miss a meal a day in Nunavut, and 6 out of 10 children. I don't remember the exact figures in terms of the food insecurity, but basically our children are paying the largest price for this. And we have amazing things going on in the territory. You have language programs, you have Inuit counseling programs in my hometown that are homegrown, community grown. You have hunting programs, but these exist in spite of basically a governance structure that has continued not to support Inuit way of life. And so when my recent, I didn't say when I introduced myself that I'm a recovering lawyer. I trained as a lawyer, not to practice as a lawyer, but to know the Canadian system, to learn the Canadian system. And I chose not to practice law because I see the practice of law. And this is not to say those that do practice law are wrong. No, this is just to explain why I chose not to, is that in the Canadian system, it's all reactionary, whereas with our teachings, it's basically to avoid social ills, to make sure that people are productive, healthy parts of society. And for me, that's the biggest test to ensuring our governance systems are working for us, is whether we have taken on a governance structure that instills those values of looking after our children, making sure that they're being raised well, and they have all the needs that to ensure that they're healthy, and that we're all productive parts of society. Right now, the incomers in Nunavut make almost 5 times more on average income than Inuit. And that's the sad reality, where the average income of Inuit has basically stayed the same, whereas the incomers continues to rise. And so when we talk about what it means to have land back, for me, it's to govern ourselves on our own terms, because the land claim agreement and the public government that we have, which is a Westminster style government, are very much Canadian systems. And if you look at our land claim in Article 2.12.1, it talks about how the Canadian laws will apply to Inuit-owned lands, and so that's it. In terms of the breakup of percentages of who owns what amounts of land, the largest land grab that we celebrated when the land claim was signed is 11%, and of the Nunavut landmass, and that's Inuit-owned land. So we still have large amounts of land that are crown lands, or municipal pockets of municipal land, obviously. And these are free entry system based, which means somebody can enter and register a claim for minerals. And so our whole economic base or relationship to the land is about destruction of our environment. And so we've never been, we're not in a place where we define our own relationship to our land, and that's the basis where we start our governance. And I think the conversation needs to go there in terms of, yes, the land claim and the public government was a start, but we need to rethink how how we're governing ourselves now. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kunuk. I'm gonna move on to Dana, Chief Dana Tizya Tramm. I just like saying your name. There's so many things I could say. So we have a lot of institutions that support land management processes, much of which has been kind of alluded to in this conversation already, such as co-management or planning regimes, et cetera, modern treaties. Do you believe that these align with, in your case, Gwich'in values?
Masito for the question, and I'm glad you enjoy my name. I tell people it's a practice in dyslexia, but it also has fingerprints from around the world through different languages, and it would take me almost a day just to explain the name, which at the end of the day isn't even my real name. Then I have a name within a name, so that's a whole another story. But I'm going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind journey here, and don't be confused, but let me start off with a quote from a couple of quotes, actually. Let me give you one from William Burroughs, who was a homosexual drug addict during the 1950s of the ilk of Allen Ginsberg. So he saw the beginning of the American dream. And he has an interesting quote that I'll end us off with, which is, "The way to kill a man or a nation is to cut off his dreams. The way the whites are taking care of the Indians, killing their dreams, their magic, their familiar spirits." Now, this is from an individual who did not fit into the regular American way of life or the American dream. And so he's an important outside third party to lean upon as we look upon where we're in today. Because as Bob Dylan said, the American dream must be a dream because you have to be asleep to see it. The next I'll put on, or the next I'll relay is from Crazy Horse. And he writes, "Upon suffering, beyond suffering, the red nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations, a world longing for light again." And as Noam Chomsky writes, a man who can remember the first atomic testing of the atomic bomb in about 45, I believe, who is almost like an academic and an elder for the world. He writes that the Grand Old Party, or the Republican Party of the United States, is the most dangerous political organization in the world. And the reason why I begin with this is because these are the modern times that we are a part of. This is the societal system that we have inherited. People don't understand the minutiae and our societal inklings with admiral or maritime or civil law. The law society, a founding pillar of our society. People don't understand it. People don't understand economic systems, our ties to central banks, our mints, and the legal tender of a banknote, a debt, or a bond of the future. So all of this to say is that we have all inherited, we're sitting to a monopoly board, and we know the rules, but we don't know where these things came from, what they really mean, or where they're going. We have some cheat codes to get us through so we can roll the dice and move along. We don't understand the very founding pillars of our society. So yes, I do believe that they can and they will align with our values if our principles guide these tools. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, for instance, the term economy, from its Latin derivative, means to manage one's household. That's what economy means. Well, since Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations piggybacked with imperialism or empiricism during the 1750s to the 1850s and the Industrial Revolution, Jared Diamond talks about it in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, as well as Charles C. Mann in his book, 1493. The Industrial Revolution took empiricism and this capitalism, wealth of nations ideology and maximized it and actualized it across the world. But these tools, they did not have human spirit, a human way of knowing and being. They were homogenized, compartmentalized mechanisms of separation that killed the analogous human spirit and way. Actually, it was even realized by not William Bowers, but William Blake, the poet at the end of the Romantic era, during the rise of the Industrial Revolution, in personal writings to some of these British aristocrats that were toying with the concept of empiricism. In personal letters, he wrote to them and he said, "What you're toying with is very dangerous. If you do not leave room for the human imagination, you will kill what it means to be a human being." Now, with this, look upon the landscapes of modernity today. There is no more ceremony besides high school graduation where you throw some funny shaped hats in the air. Where is our instinctual human debt or obligation to one another? How does that realize in economical truths, political truths, personal truths? And how have these now obscured objective truths? We need not look further than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which the BBC just put an article out today, basically said, we have 10 years to do this. We have 10 years. And what we're facing and what they're calling for is a paradigm shift in every sphere of our society. So from this diving board, I jump into Indigenous ways of knowing and being. The Indigenous principles, what are they? Principles of reciprocity, renewability, of balance, of individual self-identifying and being woven, weaving with our environments, not domination over, not separation, not compartmentalization, not homogenization. No, because we took our teachings from the land. The land taught us about banking on diversity and rewarding cooperation. This informed all of our ways of knowing and doing and being, which is why I tell international negotiators to Canadian representatives that if you want to make any meaningful change towards climate change, you need Indigenous peoples at your economic and legislative tables, because we are the closest you will get to hearing the land speak. So all of this to say is that, look at the example of the gun. The gun is great technology. Now, if you use it to decimate a buffalo population, it is terrible, but it's not the gun's fault. It is the ideology of the person that is wielding it and turning this instrument into a poison. But our people, this gun saved our people from starvation, and we made it a medicine because the way we use the gun, it strengthens animals on the land. And a quick example for how that can be done is even with our trapping practices. We literally chart the regions and where you'll see beavers or muskrats or even martens. When you see them on the land with bite marks and scars, that's where we set up and we trap, because they're overpopulated. And the numbers that we take out creates balance among their populations, so that the large ebb and flows, like the 7-year boom and bust cycles of rabbits, we look at how we can economize our presence and bring strength into our land and animals, something that the economic gun is not doing. It is decimating and homogenizing, and it is laying waste. And we are now facing a planet that is speaking back to us in climate change, in an imbalanced way that has nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution and everything to do with a worldview that was imbalanced, which now has imbalanced the world. So not only can these peripheral institutions acknowledge and work with us and should be woven into our works, but I would say that they're one of our greatest roots, because what I've heard and want to recognize in a lot of the speakers and our panelists today is a schism. When you have 5% of the Canadian population as Indigenous peoples with land claims that account for 40% of the land mass of Canada, we are not an election winner, yet we have pre-existing rights to these lands. Canada has a very large identity problem, and colonialism does not only hurt Indigenous peoples, colonialism eats its young, and it has robbed our future partners today of their own knowledge of their past. of their wrongdoings, of a way in which we can learn to even speak with one another. I mean, for Indigenous peoples whose community is interchronological, we have actual community with future generations that aren't here yet and past members who have been passed on for centuries. Then you look to an individual like Andrew Scheer. Well, how lucky are we to have Andrew Scheer before all of Canada telling them that residential schools were not genocide, for an individual whose family benefited from the disruptive and racist legislation under the Indian Act that stopped successful farmers, Indigenous farmers, from being able to bring their products to market, so that his family from Scotland could benefit over us, to now 4 generations later tell us about what our own experience in Canada is. He's disconnected from his story, he's disconnected from the land, and is a complete success of this consumer-based capitalistic totalitarian system. Now, these are a lot of fancy words and ideas and concepts that I'm throwing out there, but it all comes back very simply, and it all relaxes back to what I was saying earlier. Like Yuval Noah Harari writes, the author of Sapiens, you can dissect a human cell and you will not find a declaration for human rights. These land claims, these laws, these are for people. These are not treaties of the land. And the difference is that Indigenous peoples, for us, human rights, our land rights, our animal rights, our Indigenous rights, our human rights, they're synonymous. And in an over-quantified, compartmentalized, labeled world, we have to trip over a lexicon of complexity to bring the simplicity of our principles to arise to a system that's inherently void of these principles. I mean, our money systems are tied to the GDP, the gross domestic product. Show me the studies where the more money a person has, the happier they are, because they don't exist, going all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. So going back to economizing, Indigenous peoples are experts in economy, and we need to work with our non-Indigenous brother to educate them about the principles that would better suit the tools that they wield, these tools of reciprocity, of renewability, of the individual and diversity as a strength should be inherently realized at legislative tables, at economic tables, at technological tables, in communities, all of these different tables. I mean, we're in an age where cultural appropriation is a very sensitive topic. And there's a difference between, appropriating a grass dance or practicing renewability. These principles are not beholden to Indigenous peoples. And what I wish the rest of Canada would realize is the R&D efforts you have in Indigenous peoples, because the future of Canada is happening in Indigenous communities. It's not happening in Toronto. It's not happening in Vancouver. We will take money systems and indigenize them, because there is a lot more now that we're seeing through the IPCC. We're starting to judge ourselves as the analyzer through economic lens in the way we approach the earth. It simply doesn't work. And let me break it down this way for you. We're on the cutting edge of artificial intelligence. Harvard is creating 250 qubit machines. China is at the leading edge. Just think of it this way. If there was a superhuman computer that could analyze the world and spit out a theorem or a strategy to solve climate change, it would be saying the same things that Indigenous peoples have been for centuries, and we're right beside everyone. And what drives me crazy is that people will probably still listen to the computer over Indigenous peoples that are right here. And the difference is that we did not go to university to learn about the universe. We turned the university into our universe. And both forms of knowledge, through empiricist scientific means, but as well through the oral, traditional, observational data and practices of Indigenous peoples, are two sides, opposite sides of a coin, mind you. But when you invest in the future, you use that same coin. So it's time to get around the platitudes and the conveniences of these differences and find the limbic system that belongs to both of them, as was the partnership and sought out in the Wampum Belt, the first legal founding document of Canada. The energy is there, and we should not have to wait to a time of desperation to find these. So it would be in actually a great interest for these other outside entities to really work with indigenous communities and populations. And there's great examples of these. The Gwich'in Nation, which is about 9,000 people, we lobbied and got every single major bank in North America, from Goldman Sachs to RBC, to put into their policy that they would not develop in the sacred calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou. See, indigenous peoples can help inform the major complexities of your instruments, because I would just like to come back to the analogy, they're just a gun. And if you don't remember who you are, if you're cut off from your story, cut off from a relationship to your land, then you can be actualized by capitalism. You can be usurped, and ideas that you did not form on your own or aren't localized to your regions, you can be used like a glove for them. If you have forgotten who you are, your tools will wield you. That's why it is up to us to remember our identities, to establish these and stand on our feet. Individualism and your story and your anchor back into this planet is the strongest act of climate action, is the strongest determination of community, of health, and anything else is a foyer into the same self-indulgent inklings that has brought us to the place where we are today in the planet. So I know that's kind of a lot of a full circle, but I'm trying to do the best in the time that I'm allotted to really show that we're both, it's like the adage of the five blind wise men feeling an elephant, and they're all saying, it's 5 different things. We're feeling the same thing. It's just we're coming at it from different places. And there is a synergy and a relationship that belongs to those things. And if we focus on this schism and what splinters them, we're going to find that. And I find a lot of kinetic energy and solutions in looking at how modern tools, corporations, and even law can practice indigenous principles, which is the fastest hack and route towards dealing with climate change and just about every other issue that the compartmentalization and separation in modern society has really brought today. Merci.
Thank you, Dana. It's so good I have so many quotes here just from that little bit of presentation. So thank you very much. We do have a bit of time before we go to the audience questions. So, and I kind of debated about this before the call today. I was like, am I really going to try and do like a lightning round of questions for panelists on such a big topic? But we're going to try it. So I'll ask the same question to each of you. We'll start with you again, Natan. Can our conceptualizations of land back be enacted outside of a treaty framework?
Absolutely. Kunuk talked about modern treaties being a part of a whole. And there's so many other components that would do better if modern treaties were implemented. But as a part of self-determination, we as Inuit and those of us who work in Inuit governance, we actually can do without modern treaties. That we have assets, we have skills, we have knowledge. We have now an emerging set of a diverse amount of tools to help with child welfare, to help with poverty reduction and food security, to help with language and culture. I think part of the exercise in any role that we play, whether it be a community level role, a familial level role, or a national level role, is to figure out how you can align the things that you are doing in your life and the things you're doing in your work with the principles of self-determination and this cultural rejuvenation that we are all wanting, and what our elders and those who have guided us all along in this way have said again and again are the ways in which we will find our balance and create the best possible society for Inuit to live in.
Thank you. Kris, same question for you. Can our conceptualizations of land back be enacted outside of a treaty framework?
I guess my answer would say it depends, I guess, on how we think about treaty and what treaty means. But I would say yes, it does exist outside of a treaty framework as well, and can be enacted outside of the treaty framework. I think as we've talked about today already, just the modern treaty is as a tool or instrument of one pathway that, at least in all of our circumstances, our communities and nations have decided that that's the pathway that they sought to take. And of course we have pretty unique circumstances demographically from other regions. The land and the environment is much different, the history is different, and so totally understand that something like a comprehensive land claim agreement isn't going to make sense for Indigenous peoples everywhere. But that said, there's these many different tools, but I think whatever the framework is, whether it's treaty or otherwise, I really do think we've been talking about just some of the challenges that we face and experience in implementation. At the end of the day, whatever our framework is for pursuing land back or self-determination, whatever you want to call it, it's going to require cooperation. It's going to require really, just thinking of, the climate crisis, unparalleled levels of working together, at the community level, with our neighbors, other First Nations, our treaty partners, but as well, internationally, our Gwich'in relatives that live in Alaska, Indigenous peoples in the circumpolar north and the Arctic, around the globe, the global south, communities, experiencing disproportionately in a similar way as us in the Arctic, climate change. How do we pursue or even be successful in a vision of land back without working with those other people, just given the nature of the issues and the challenges we all face? So I see some might say that is, I guess, another type of treaty or treaty relationships, those treaties that we have with each other, or with non-humans and other living beings within our own legal orders. How do we uphold those responsibilities in those relationships? Obviously, modern treaties are one way, but there's other ways. But regardless of what tool we're using, we got to work together at the end of the day, I believe. There's obviously significant challenges that we all face, whether we're in treaty or not. We didn't, discover some and unlock some imagined, post-colonial door where, we signed an agreement and, did away with the Indian Act. And then all of a sudden, colonialism was over. We're still experiencing that colonial relationship as well. And it's really, I think, working with other people who have experienced colonization, who are dealing with similar, just like material conditions in their communities in terms of, health and social outcomes, just the general wellness of the people. We're all facing similar issues and challenges. And so, I think regardless of the framework that we're working with, finding ways to, share and collaborate and visit with one another again is going to be really important for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Kris. Kunuk?
Yes, that's my short answer. And they do. And I mentioned this earlier in terms of there's things that go on in our communities that are that continue the relationship with the land. I mentioned the Young Hunters program in Arvet, for example. In my hometown, Inuutiq, there's a lot of work. They have full-time hunters, and I know some of the listeners are from there, and do a lot of fundraising to ensure that those are in place, and they would probably still exist whether or not the current systems are in place or not. The Heritage Society in Qitirmut, the Piruvik Center here in Iqaluit, Meli Kohli and her language work. There are so many examples of amazing work that people are doing, even Laakkuluk and her art, that assert ourselves and our relationship to our land, and defining our own economies. And so just to say that it does happen. And I think if we think about colonialism and these treaties being part of the continued relationship with colonialism, there's a question of whether we entered these relationships under duress, and because we maybe believe that the Canadian narrative, that it wasn't our land anymore, and we basically could get, we got what we could get, or believed what we could get. And I, in terms of where we are, I put no blame into our past negotiators and leaders. They worked so hard to get what we got. And colonialism is a cunning beast, and I would say that we were duped into buying into a system we thought would work for us. And the programs that I mentioned, I think, really bring back the sense of community and kinship that colonialism tried to take away from us, because it created faction in our families and our communities, and brings that, maintain that relationship within, not just, as Kris mentioned, not just within people, but our relationship to the land, the waters that that Natan mentioned the ocean is very important to us, and all the wildlife and the living things that we coexist with. So it's just a matter of trying to grow what's already there. Emma.
Okay, thanks, Kunuk. Chief Dana Tizya Tramm.
Uh-oh, you gave me the floor again. You say that name so well.
I practice.
I would I would go so far as to say that our conceptualizations of land back and being enacted outside of the treaty framework is actually the most important implementation. Now, as I spoke about earlier, the quote from William Burroughs, the best way to kill a nation or a man is to destroy his dreams. You can't quantify or treaty around dreams. And that's what I was alluding to in William Blake's staunch warning to the British aristocrats around empiricism and the Industrial Revolution, was that their system cannot dream. That's what kills to be a human. You know, I am a young man who, for whatever reason, find myself here implementing this modern treaty, sitting down with ministers. But more important are our youth who are drawing pictures of their caribou camps and their salmon camps in crayon. More important are our youth who are continuing to hear the stories of their ancestors. I mean, I'll give you an example. One treaty implementation of our land, for instance, and land back, the reason why I came to Old Crow was I was down in Vancouver with this wonderful vintage 1970s motorcycle jacket, a $50 haircut, a pair of skinny jeans, and, you know, the world at my feet. But I was dislocated from everything, making me a tumbleweed. I had no roots. I was blown around by the topical winds of culture, by economies from the 2018 fallout, etc. But it was only when I was offered everything I wanted, financial security, a house, I was offered everything. It was laid at my feet. And that's what really made me think. And I ended up coming to Old Crow because my grandfather, they say, will be one of the last to have dog teamed from Dawson City to Old Crow, which is almost, well, he did it basically 3 times. And so that's like going across, dog teaming across France. And so that helped me to realize that Dana's not Dana. I'm actually this really small, recent bud on an ancient branch, a part of a timeless tree that roots go to the center of the earth. And that changed everything for me, because Dana today, dislocated from all of that, I can go and chase money, I can get the glittering prizes, I can wear that motorcycle jacket. But when all of my ancestors are there, that motorcycle jacket is cheap and trite. And a lot of my life became like that. So through them and me acknowledging that, allowing them to live through me, there is no treaty framework for that. And it's more important, those dreams, those aspirations, those primordial inklings and connections to the land are the most important. That's our spiritual and being umbilical cord. And you know what? Take a look at climate change right now. It's so stark. There are geopolitical considerations that at the end of the century, for instance, over in India, fed by the Himalayas, their 5 rivers are going to dry up. And imagine when you have Egypt already threatening war over the damming of the Nile. Even water at the end of the century is going to shape geopolitics. So I say that because the laws and these treaties that we have for today, are they even going to really be around in 100 or 200 years? Again, going back to the law of creator, the law of creation, these are the things that we can't forget. So a treaty is a recent machination, a jurisdictional legislative epidermis to protect our hearts and our dreams from the piercing kill shot of colonialism. And I think we can all agree that we may have been wounded. The question is whether we have the time and the space to heal and recover. And that's not something I'll necessarily weigh into. but really want to exemplify the point that the treaty implementation in the larger scheme of things is not necessarily a distraction, but it's a pebble in our shoe, and one in which we do need to continue to hold the Crown accountable and its representatives, but moreover in a dam to save our people from the massive flood that is colonial in its inertia as we know it today. Let's see.
Thanks, Dana. So many good sound bites, so many good quotes. I think, well, we've kind of come to the end of our panel questions that were drafted, so I'll turn it over to Hayden.
First of all, I want to say I wish we had spent made the event a little bit. I don't know if longer is the right word, but I think there's a lot to discuss here, and we're not really getting to it all. I regret that we didn't have an opportunity to hear from each of you more on all of these questions, but maybe we can figure out a way to do something like this again. So thank you to everybody for coming, our panelists, also the guests that joined. Very sorry to the 400 other people that didn't get into the event. And I think Jay has one final thing to say before we go.
Happy birthday, Ningyo. It's Kunuk's birthday today, and this is her birthday party. So I just wanted to say thanks and happy birthday to Kunuk.
Should we sing? Okay, well, we won't do that. Happy birthday. Thank you, everybody, again, and thanks to the Modern Treaty Research Implementation Project, and of course, Yellowhead Institute. We'll see you all again really soon. Thank you.
See you, Joe.
Thanks, everyone.